The economy of Puerto Rico is classified as a high-income economy by the World Bank and is the most competitive economy in Latin America by the World Economic Forum. The main drivers of its economy are manufacturing, primarily pharmaceuticals, textiles, petrochemicals, and electronics, followed by the service industry, notably finance, insurance, real estate, and tourism. The geography of Puerto Rico and its political status are both determining factors on its economic prosperity, primarily due to its relatively small size as an island, its lack of natural resources used to produce raw materials, and, consequently, its dependence on imports, as well as its suzerainty to the United States, which controls its foreign policies while exerting trading restrictions, particularly in its shipping industry. At the macroeconomic level, Puerto Rico has been experiencing an economic depression for 10 consecutive years, starting in 2006 after a series of negative cash flows and the expiration of the Section 936 that applied to Puerto Rico of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. This section was critical for the economy of the island as it established tax exemptions for U.S. corporations that settled in Puerto Rico and allowed its subsidiaries operating in the island to send their earnings to the parent corporation at any time, without paying federal tax on corporate income. Puerto Rico has, however, surprisingly been able to maintain a relatively low inflation in the past decade. Academically, most of Puerto Rico's economic woes stem from federal regulations that expired, have been repealed, or no longer apply to Puerto Rico, from its inability to become self-sufficient and self-sustainable throughout history, from its highly politicized public policy which tends to change whenever a political party gains power, as well as from its highly inefficient local government, which has accrued a public debt equal to 66% of its gross domestic product throughout time. In comparison to the different states of the United States, Puerto Rico is poorer than the poorest state of the United States, with 45% of its population living below the poverty line. However, when compared to Latin America, Puerto Rico has the highest GDP per capita in the region, as well as being the most competitive economy among Ibero-American states, surpassing Chile and Spain. The Commonwealth has a modern infrastructure, a large public sector, and an institutional framework guided by the regulations of U.S. federal agencies, most of which have an active and continued presence in the island. Its main trading partners of the United States itself, Ireland, and Japan, with most products coming from East Asia, mainly from China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. At a global scale, Puerto Rico's dependency on oil for transportation and electricity generation, as well as its dependency on food imports and raw materials, makes Puerto Rico volatile and highly reactive to changes in the world economy and climate. History. Puerto Rico, like many other countries, has transitioned from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. Its economy is currently experiencing a transformation caused by the information age, albeit slowly. Pre-colonialism. Not much is known about the economic history of Puerto Rico prior to the arrival of Spaniards. The little that is known about its inhabitants, the Taino, is that their economy was a mixture of hunting and gathering with agriculture. The Taino captured and ate small animals, such as mammals, earthworms, lizards, turtles, and birds. Manatees were speared and fish were caught in nets, speared, poisoned, trapped in weirs, or caught with hook and line. Wild parrots were decoyed with domesticated birds, and iguanas were taken from trees and other vegetation. Livestock was not practiced as there were no large animals native to Puerto Rico that could be raised in an agricultural setting in order to produce commodities such as food. fiber, or labor. Fields for important root crops, such as the staple yucca, were prepared by heaping up mounds of soil, called conucos. This improved soil drainage and fertility as well as delaying erosion, and it allowing for a longer storage of crops in the ground. Less important crops such as corn were raised in simple clearings created by slash-and-burn technique. Typically, conucos were 3 feet high and 9 feet in circumference and were arranged in rows. The primary root crop was yucca cassava, a woody shrub cultivated for its edible and starchy tuberous root. It was planted using a coir, a kind of homemade completely from wood. Women processed the poisonous variety of cassava by squeezing it to extract the toxic juices. Then they would grind the roots into flour for baking bread. Batata was the next most important root crop. Contrary to mainland practices, corn was not ground into flour and baked into bread. It was cooked and eaten off the cob. Cornbread becomes moldy faster than cassava bread in the high humidity of the West Indies. The Taino grew squash, beans, peppers, peanuts, and pineapples. Tobacco, calabashes and cotton were grown around the houses. Other fruits and vegetables, such as palm nuts, guavas, and zamia roots, were collected from the wild. Spanish rule. The economy of Puerto Rico was transformed drastically upon the arrivals of Spaniards in 1493 until their departure in 1898. The economy during that period was driven by slavery of the native population, the Taino, and by slaves brought from Africa. Slaves were minimally remunerated for forced to work in farms, mines, households, and other aspects. Agriculture was the primary mean of production, as well as livestock, which was originally imported from Europe. Sugar cane, tobacco, coffee, and minor fruits were the primary cultivations which were exported to Europe and, by so, constituted the main economy for the island. Mining of gold, silver, and copper occurred as well, although not as much as in other territories during the Spanish colonization of the Americas. United States rule in the early 20th century. The greatest contributor to Puerto Rico's economy was agriculture, and its main crop was sugar, displacing other cash crops such as tobacco and coffee. In 1935, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the Puerto Rican Reconstruction Administration, which provided agricultural development, public works, and electrification of the island. Economic conditions have improved dramatically since the Great Depression because of external investment in capital-intensive industries such as petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals and technology. Starting in the late 1940s, a series of projects called Operation Bootstrap encouraged, using tax exemptions, the establishment of factories. Thus, manufacturing replaced agriculture as the main industry of the island. Operation Bootstrap was based on an industrialization-first campaign and modernization, focusing the Puerto Rican economy on exports, especially to the United States. As a result, Puerto Rico is now classified as a high-income country by the World Bank. Though initially there were large gains in employment and per capita income, recessions in the United States were magnified in the country and have repeatedly hampered Puerto Rican development. With the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement, Puerto Rico lost a trade advantage over some Latin American countries as the right to duty-free imports to the U.S. market were expanded. Puerto Rico is also subject to the minimum wage laws of the United States, which gives lower-wage countries such as Mexico and the Dominican Republic an economic advantage in the Caribbean. Once the beneficiary of special tax treatment from the U.S. government, today local industries must compete with those in more economically depressed parts of the world where wages are not subject to U.S. minimum wage legislation. In recent years, some U.S. and foreign-owned factories have moved to lower-wage countries in Latin America and Asia. Puerto Rico is subject to U.S. trade laws and restrictions. Also, starting around 1950, there was heavy migration from Puerto Rico to the continental United States, particularly New York City, in search of better economic conditions. Puerto Rican migration to New York displayed an average yearly migration of 1,800 for the years 1930 to 1940, 31,000 for 1946 to 1950, 45,000 for 1951 to 1960, and a peak of 75,000 in 1953. As of 2003, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that more people of Puerto Rican birth or ancestry live in the U.S. than in Puerto Rico. Recent developments. On May 1, 2006, the Puerto Rican government faced significant shortages in cash flows, which forced the closure of the local Department of Education and 42 other government agencies. All 1,536 public schools closed, and 95,762 people were furloughed in the first-ever partial shutdown of the government in the island's history. On May 10, 2006, the budget crisis was resolved with a new tax reform agreement so that all government employees could return to work. On November 15, 2006, a 5.5% sales tax was implemented. Municipalities are required by law to apply a municipal sales tax of 1.5%, bringing the total sales tax to 7%. The public debt of Puerto Rico has grown at a faster pace than the growth of its economy, reaching $46.7 billion in 2008. In January 2009, Luis Fortuno enacted several measures aimed at eliminating the government's $3.3 billion deficit, including laying off 12,505 government employees. Puerto Rico's unemployment rate was 15.9% in January 2010. Some analysts said they expect the government's layoffs to propel that rate to 17%. In November 2010, Gov. Fortuno proposed a tax reform plan that would be implemented in a 6-year period, retroactive to January 1, 2010. The first phase, applicable to year 2010, reduces taxes to all individual taxpayers by 7 to 15%. By year 2016, average relief for individual taxpayers will represent a 50% tax cut and a 30% cut for corporate taxpayers, whose tax rate will be lowered from 41 to 30%. At the same time, the latest report by the President Task Force on Puerto Rico's status recognizes that the status question and the economy are intimately linked. Many participants in the forums conducted by the task force argued that uncertainty about status is holding Puerto Rico back in economic areas. And although there are a number of economic actions that should be taken immediately or in the short term, regardless of the ultimate outcome of the status question, identifying the most effective means of assisting the Puerto Rican economy depends on resolving the ultimate question of status. In short, the long-term economic well-being of Puerto Rico would be dramatically improved by an early decision on the status question. During fiscal year, the consolidated budget for the archipelago, including both direct transfers from federal programs, represented more than $28.7 billion, or approximately 30% of its GDP, while revenues surpassed $31 billion. In 2010, federal transfers amounted $16.710 billion, while the Commonwealth's government managed funds of $10.12 billion. As a result of the recent reduction of Spain's credit rating, Puerto Rico holds the second highest credit rating awarded by the agency to a Spanish-speaking territory in the long term. In June 2013, a $300 million U.S. Medicaid payment to Puerto Rico was delayed because the Puerto Rican government had changed the nationally sponsored insurance carrier without obtaining approval from the U.S. Health and Human Services Department. This one of several troubling economic developments, including high debt-to-population ratios that have, per Forbes magazine, caused consternation in the U.S. municipal bond market. Puerto Rico has been experiencing an economic depression for 10 consecutive years, starting in 2006 after a series of negative cash flows and the expiration of the Section 936 that applied to Puerto Rico of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. This section was critical for the economy as it established tax exemptions for U.S. corporations that settled in Puerto Rico and allowed its subsidiaries operating in the island to send their earnings to the parent corporation at any time, without paying federal tax on corporate income. The government has also experienced 16 consecutive negative cash flows since 2000, exacerbating its fragile economic situation as the government is forced to incur new debt in order to pay the old one. Puerto Rico has, however, surprisingly been able to maintain a relatively low inflation in the past decade. Academically, most of Puerto Rico's economic woes stem from federal regulations that expired, have been repealed, or no longer apply to Puerto Rico. Its inability to become self-sufficient and self-sustainable throughout history, its highly politicized public policy which tends to change whenever a political party gains power, as well as its highly inefficient local government which has accrued a public debt equal to 66% of its gross domestic product throughout time.